So it's time for another REACHLaw webinar, and today we are going to talk about the KKDIK regulation and specifically the lead registration process. And this will be the number 3, part 3 of a 3-part series on lead registrations in Turkey. And today we are going to talk about joint registration management. So today we have 3 experts who will present their own parts in this webinar. So we'll start with Sibel, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Sibel Kılıç. I'm working at REACHLaw Turkey as a regulatory affairs manager and I live in Istanbul. I am a chemist as a background and I hold a PhD in organic chemistry. I have knowledge on worldwide regulatory standards related to environmental health and safety compliance of chemicals, and my main areas of expertise are REACH and REACH-like global chemical regulations as KKDIK. Thank you, Frederik.
Thank you, Sibel. Sami, if you please introduce yourself.
Hello everybody, my name is Sami Vesikansa and I have managed affairs of lead registrations at REACHLaw for 10 years. Our team has submitted successfully over 100 lead dossiers in EU, including several complex substances known as UVCBs. We have submitted most of the lead registration dossiers as an only representative for non-European manufacturers. Furthermore, I am responsible for managing several EU lead registrations and consortia. I evaluate actions needed upon the compliance check decisions from ECHA and provide data access services for new registrants of existing joint submissions. During recent years, I have been involved in the lead registration process transfer and set up local practices in UK and in Turkey. And last year, we submitted our first lead dossier to Turkish authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. And last, my name is Frederik Johanson. I'm a partner, head of sales at REACHLaw, worked with chemical regulatory topics for I think already almost 18 years. Time flies. And I'll be one of the hosts today. Okay, so that's enough for the introductions. So just some practical information regarding the webinar. So you should be able to use the chat function to send questions to us. So use the chat function and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session when we have the Q&A. Time permitting, of course. And questions you've sent in advance of this webinar, we'll definitely answer those at the end. And there will be a recording of this webinar and you will be provided with a link after within a few days. And I believe this will also actually come up on our YouTube channel. We'll talk about that in just a few slides. And if there's a need, then we'll also prepare a Q&A document and share it with all the participants in this webinar. And of course, in any case, please feel free to send us feedback. We appreciate that very much and always want to, of course, develop ourselves in our webinars. Okay, so coming to the agenda for today. So as mentioned, the joint registration management for Turkey KKDIK will be the focus, and this will be the 3rd episode in this long webinar series on KKDIK lead registrations. And we'll start off with a brief introduction to REACHLaw. Then we'll look at Turkey, the KKDIK regulation, just a quick overview, and then also give you an overview on the registration part, so what that means. And then we'll dive into the depth of the joint registration management and end up with going through an action plan, looking at some conclusions before going to the Q&A, of course, at the end. And this will probably be a bit of a longish webinar, so please bear with us if it takes more than 60 minutes, which I'm sure it will do. Okay, so just some disclaimers. So any actions you may take based on this presentation is of course your responsibility. So we accept no responsibilities on the contents and correctness in this presentation. And of course no liabilities thereof. Just the routine disclaimer. Have a read later on if you like. So REACHLaw in brief, who are we? So we provide chemical regulatory support services for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So this now, of course, nowadays also encompasses Turkey and the KKDIK regulation, but also the UK REACH regulation, Eurasia REACH, India REACH, and K-REACH. So a lot of REACHes there, but besides, of course, the EU REACH regulation. Today we'll, of course, focus on Turkey KKDIK and specifically the registration, lead registration part thereof. So just a quick look at our offices, because those, as you saw in those in the regulations, essentially supported. Some of the regulations we're supporting. We also have local legal entities in these countries, these regions, for the purpose of providing, for example, only representative services. The only one is that we're not indigenously or natively supporting is K-REACH, and that's why we do not have an office in South Korea. But we do have, as Sibel mentioned, an office in Istanbul through which we provide KKDIK services, for example. Just a few words about our services. So we provide a full suite of services for KKDIK, starting with the only representative services, as well as late pre-registration or pre-registration services, the full set of lead registration and co-registration services, consortia management, lead registration, support services related to SIEF management, and the whole ball of wax, so to speak. So this, the lead registration part and the SIEF management part is obviously something that we will look at today in more detail. So we really specialize and focus on chemical regulatory compliance and sustainability to a certain degree also. And as I mentioned at the beginning about looking at the recording of this live webinar, you will likely see it also on our YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks. So I invite you to go over to our YouTube channel and have a look. We'll post new videos there fairly regularly and try to keep up to pace with the developments in the chemical regulatory world. And just thought it would be nice to also just give a quick update on the global regulatory news, if you will. So what's next? So obviously, if we start with the Eurasia REACH regulation, that's something that is expected to enter into force late in 2023. There are some second-tier implementing regulations that will be approved likely later this year, as well as some fundamental GOST standards also later this year to be approved. So Eurasia REACH is still ahead of us, so to speak. Something that's not ahead of us is the UK REACH regulation, which is a copy of the EU REACH, by the way, as is the Turkey KKDIK regulation also. At the moment, we have the late due notification procedure still possible in the UK for UK REACH purposes, and there's discussion ongoing about potentially postponing the first actual registration deadlines with a few years from 23 to 25. On the practical side, lead registration dossier developments have already started, and REACHLaw has, for example, already submitted lead dossiers for UK REACH purposes. As for upcoming regulations, we have India REACH coming up potentially later this year if things go as planned, or then it will be postponed. It depends really on the government agenda in India. And K-REACH, just a final note that the first registration deadline for the high tonnage substances and CMRs at 1 ton or more was end of last year. So the next registration deadline is for the lesser tonnage band of 100 to 1,000, and that is end of 2024. So that was just a quick update of the global regulatory updates. And so what's next, essentially. Okay, so now we're heading off to the quick overview of Turkey KKDIK provided by Sibel. So Sibel, please.
Thank you, Frederik. Let's start with the Turkey KKDIK quick overview. KKDIK regulation is actually been in force since 2017 already, so there are certain transitional provisions that apply, such as the pre-registration and then the registration. We will look at this in more details during the next slides. So the KKDIK acronym comes from, translated into English as Regulation on Chemicals, Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction. So very similar to the REACH acronym, obviously it's in Turkish. That's where the KKDIK comes from. Also for your information that the counterpart of the authority side is the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change in this regulation. And the basic requirements are, as with EU REACH, the requirement to pre-register and register substances manufactured in or imported into Turkey at 1 ton or more per year. So there is same requirement saying that no data, no markets, which essentially means that if you don't provide the information about your substance, in other words, register your substances with the information requirement, you will not have a market in Turkey. The KKDIK regulation is essentially a copy of the EU REACH regulation. So go actually here as many times over that. If you know EU REACH, then you will know the Turkey REACH. So Turkey KKDIK to high degree. I will not go in details here, but looking at the scope, we can say that the 99% of the substances are within the scope of the KKDIK regulation, meaning that all of these substances in one way or another have to comply with the KKDIK regulation and the requirements. So essentially, we can almost say that all substances, unless specifically exempted, are within the scope of KKDIK regulation. So the threshold for substances requiring a KKDIK pre-registration and registration when manufactured in or imported into Turkey is 1 ton or more per year. So we will just look at the only representative. We would like to highlight that it is good for you to understand as a non-Turkish manufacturer or as a non-Turkish formulator, you can assign an only representative in Turkey to take care on KKDIK importer obligations. So this is pre-registration and registration. So this is again the same setup as it was in EU REACH purposes. So when you select an only representative, they must be a Turkish company and also have a sufficient background in the practical handling of substances and information related to these substances. Here we can go shortly to introduce the KKS. The translation means Chemical Registration System, and as short it is the KKS. It is an online hybrid system combining REACH IT, iEuclid and Kazar tool, and everything is online. So you cannot use it offline or download any dossier or cannot use as an application as it is used in Europe. So everything is online and everything is of course in Turkish language, and you have to have Turkish citizenship enabled to create an access for this account. For those who are in Turkey and not create an account yet, they should know that it may take up to 2 to 3 weeks to activate the account. So you can access the KKS system by using this link below, but you should create a company account on ECBS and then access to the KKS system. And here we go with the KKDIK registration overview. The registration window for all substances that are manufactured in Turkey or imported into Turkey at 1 ton per year or more, and it's not specifically exempted, need to be registered at the end of December 2023. So the registration window is the same for all substances, regardless of the tonnage band. However, the tonnage bands are the same as for EU REACH, so 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1000 and over 1000 tons, where by each tonnage band, the information requirements are increasing as well as obviously the costs. And as for the registration types, we have the full substance, which I would say as a default, on-site isolated intermediate, then also transported isolated intermediate. I will not go into details for the definitions here, but could say that all definitions on the registration types are the same as in the EU REACH regulation. Submissions, of course, are made in Turkish language as mentioned in previous parts. This slide highlights the registration window for all the tonnage bands. They all have started from beginning of the last year and will continue until the end of the December, so December 31st, 2023. This is a bit different than we have for EU REACH purposes. These are all ending at the same time and have the same registration deadline. So talking about this briefly, but in practice, we could say the data required for the endpoints increases by the tonnage bands. So as you can see, the highest tonnage band has the highest requirements, while 1 to 10 only has annex 7 data requirements to satisfy. Further on, the substances that are at 10 tons or more that are not intermediates will also need to submit the chemical safety report with the registration dossier. So these are exactly the same as the data requirements in REACH. So from 1st of January 2024, if you are starting to place a new substance on the Turkish markets or any substances that you have not registered, you will first have to go through the inquiry procedure, and once the inquiry has been accepted, you can go ahead and submit your registration. But only once the registration has been submitted and you have been issued a registration number, only then you can start placing your substance on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more annually. Then let's look at joint submissions. The idea is that each pre-registrant of the same substance will have to take a part in a joint registration effort of jointly submitting registration, meaning submitting co-registration data on behalf of the substance. It essentially means all the analytical tox, ecotox, Fischam data to the ministry in Turkey in similar way as in EU REACH, where we have one company becoming a lead registrant for a joint submission and all other registrants for the same substance becoming a co-registrant. So individual submission is not possible unless you have some sort of special permissions from ministry, because the same OXO principle, the one substance, one registration principle applies also in Turkey. But in this SIEF that we talked about, in this cooperation of companies, you will then eventually enter into become a SIEF, and you will share the data, you will share the cost in a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory way, and then eventually go ahead and submit the joint registration where you will become registrant under the KKDIK in Turkey. So as mentioned, the joint submission are mandatory also in Turkey, and individual submissions will not be possible unless you have special permissions. So what is the lead registrant and what do they have to do? So what are the responsibilities they take up upon themselves in the SIEF? So of course, they take up on themselves to manage and lead the SIEF work and get organized and coordinate the work and clarify the substance identity. You need to collect and assemble the required data to fulfill the data requirements. So share these costs fairly, transparently, and non-discriminatorily, and then provide a letter of access. You have to manage whole joint registration effort and submit your registration before the deadline. They have to keep registration up to date, keep records, and communicate with the authorities. And co-registrant, these are the companies who are the other registrants except the lead, who then have to take a part in this cooperation and agree on substance identity, and of course agree on who becomes the lead. And also these co-registrants have to share the data, have to share the costs, and other than that have the same obligation to compile and submit the co-registration as part of the joint submission before the registration deadline. Then also keep the records and communicate the authorities. Just wanted to highlight here the registration fees for registering according to the KKDIK as part of the joint submission. So you can see for intermediates and for 1 to 10 tonnage band substances, the registration cost is very low. And also going up, the fees increase for the highest tonnage band, but it is still less than by comparing the EU REACH registration fees. Here you can see some KKDIK related statistics, and I would say that 18,000 different substances have been reported to be KKDIK pre-registered according to the latest announcement by the authority, I mean unique substances. We can say that out of the more than 2,000 substances that REACHLaw is following, some 700 already have lead registrant nominated, and by the end of 2021, more than 100 lead registrations have been submitted to the authority. It seems at this stage that most lead registrants are only representatives for non-Turkish companies. Thank you, Freddie, and I give floor to you.
Thank you, Sibel. Okay, so next let's look at the joint registration management part. So that is a very wide subject, obviously. So we'll just split that into subsections, looking at, give you just first an overview, then look at the sale of letter of accesses and considerations thereof. Then we'll look at specifically how to manage joint registration and what to take into account, and also as part of the whole management is of course to keep the dossier up to date and maintain compliance. So first, just an overview of the process from pre-registration to registration. So obviously when you pre-register a substance in Turkey for KKDIK purposes, you provide the substance ID, and with this you become a member of a pre-SIEF. This is possible, as Sibel mentioned already, all the way until the end of the deadline, so end of 2023. So once you have pre-registered, you're a member of SIEF, pre-SIEF, in which you will then agree to the substance identity with other companies who have pre-registered the same substance, and then eventually form a SIEF. And there's no deadline to do this, but the sooner the better. And also as part of this SIEF formation is the election of a lead registrant. So this is something that has to be done. There's no deadline again, but the sooner you do this, the better, obviously, because the lead registrant is in an instrumental role in leading the whole joint registration work and taking it forward. And of course, no one else can submit a registration dossier before it has been prepared and submitted by the lead registrant. And once the lead registrant has submitted their registration dossier, so the lead dossier, this should be, of course, done in very good time before the registration deadline, in order to give enough time for the co-registrants to be able to purchase, of course, a letter of access and join the joint submission by submitting their own dossier. And of course, just submitting entails that you've also compiled the dossier. So all this takes time. So it's good for the lead to try to submit the lead dossier as soon as possible, so that the co-registrants can start joining in gradually. And everyone should, of course, be mindful of the fact that the deadline is the end of 2023 for all tonnage bands at the same time, which is different from EU REACH, for example. Okay, so looking at the lead registration process and the actions related, so you can see that some of the parts have been faded out, if you will. These are the parts of the process that we've covered in previous webinars, so please have a look at those. We've also covered co-registrations, and this is something that we will also have a webinar coming up during the spring, so stay tuned. But today, as said, we'll look at the letter of access sales, so this is the number 9, joint registration management number 10, and lead dossier maintenance number 11. And the communication, SIEF communication that relates to that is, of course, related to the SIEF agreement, law sales and updates and other housekeeping tasks by the lead registrant. So these will be the topics discussed, and that's why the numbering starts at 9. So first up is the letter of access, sales and related considerations. So just some background, some basics. So to join a joint submission, then each co-registrant obviously has to have legitimate access to the information that is used in the joint submission submitted by the lead registrant in order to be able to join. So this means that you need to honor the IPR of the actual data owners that have provided data for the lead dossier. So what this means is that as a co-registrant, you need to compensate for the work that has been done and for the data that has been used to prepare the lead dossier and the joint submission. And all of this must, as Sibyl also mentioned, happen under fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory conditions. So this is in the regulation itself, as is in the EU REACH regulation also. So this is one of those places where we word for word copy, as is of course most of the regulation in Turkey. So the most common mechanism of sharing data and the related costs within this joint submission is to have the lead registrant issue a so-called letter of access. Sometimes people talk about the LOAS, but this means the letter of access. And this is issued against a fair and transparent fee to all the companies who have pre-registered the substance and who want to also go forward to actually join the joint submission by submitting their own co-registration for the same substance. So the letter of access or law is a term that is used to describe an agreement on the sharing of data and the granting of a right to refer to the data for the registrants for a certain fee. So for the co-registrant, looking at, for example, the EU REACH regulation and also looking at what we know of already for KKDIK, the letter of accesses will be typically the most expensive component of the whole co-registration process for KKDIK. As we saw earlier, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Urbanization and Climate Change authority fees are fairly small, as you can see. So it is easy to understand that the data will be the highest single component that will cost the most. So looking at accessing the joint submission via this letter of access process, so give you an overview thereof. So the way it works is that the lead registrant will then communicate with all the potential co-registrants and provide a letter of access agreement, or it can be sometimes called something else. For example, a SIEF agreement or cooperation agreement. In this presentation, we'll talk about the SIEF agreement that includes also the letter of access. And it will communicate that this is available for the substance in question. And as mentioned earlier, this should be done as soon as possible once the lead has submitted their dossier, or even before, when the lead, for example, knows all the costs, associated costs with the registration. Then the co-registrant who wants to join the joint submission then signs this SIEF agreement. It can be an acceptance letter or something similar, and then they pay the letter of access fee. So the letter of access fee typically depends on, of course, the type of registration. Is it the full substance or an intermediate? Is it what the tonnage band is? If you have own data that needs to be taken into account, etc. And co-registrants should initiate from their side the letter of access obtaining process as soon as it is available, because sometimes this just takes time. And looking at agreements and transferring money and so forth, it just takes time, and also understanding what you're registering and what the lead registrant is providing as part of the joint submission, which we will look at in the next slide. And then once the co-registrant essentially has entered into agreement and paid, then they will provide access to the joint submission through the KKS system. So this will happen essentially automatically in KKS once the lead gives essentially ticks a box in the KKS system. I will have a look at this in a few slides. Okay, so what is covered typically by the letter of access, and what are the topics that and contents that is covered, can be covered, or must be covered? So always included in the letter of access is actually the standard information set, which means like information about the composition, the boundary composition, identified uses, classification, labeling, and so forth. And these are the same for all registrants. Of course, the co-registrant may then have a subset of, for example, the identified uses that they will adhere to in their dossier, and do not have to necessarily list all the identified uses which are not relevant for them. But it's always a subset of the uses identified in the lead dossier. Then optionally, it's good to understand that the chemical safety report and guidance of safe use is not mandatory to be provided by the lead registrant. So it means that this is something that the lead registrant provides, but it is optional. So be mindful of this when you purchase the letter of access. Make sure that if there's an option to include coverage in of a CSR, meaning you also get a CSR covered either yourself that you have to submit as part of your co-registration, or you are covered in the lead dossier submitted by the lead registrant. Just make sure that this is available, because if it's not, then you have to prepare it yourself, and that can be quite an undertaking. But good to understand that CSR is not mandatory to be provided by the lead registrant. So they don't have to provide it, but typically they do, because it's in everyone's best interest to have the same chemical safety report across the whole submission. Optionally, also, they can provide guidance of safe use. They can be submitted in the lead dossier on behalf of essentially the whole joint submission, or then also submitted separately. So what this looks like in the KKS system is that the lead company can then essentially identify, once companies have pre-registered substances, they can identify companies in the SIEF, and then they can confirm these companies as a member of the joint submission when they have completed the necessary SIEF agreement and purchased the letter of access. So it's not like in the EU where you had to provide the joint submission name and a token to be submitted by the co-registrant as part of the co-registration process. It's a bit more actually advanced in the sense that the lead registrant simply accepts these companies that are listed, companies who have pre-registered the same substance, into the joint submission, provided they have, of course, then entered into agreement and purchased the letter of access. And on the right-hand side, you can also see that the lead registrant can select whether to include the guidance of safe use and the CSR or the CSR as part of the joint submission. So there are tick boxes there. Obviously, everything is in Turkish language. I just wanted to show you that also. So looking at the SIEF agreement, so the idea is that it provides the co-registrants with the access rights to the joint submission. So it's de facto the agreement you need to have to get access. And it also describes the costs that will be shared amongst all the companies who are joining the joint submission as registrants. It also defines how the SIEF and the joint submission is organized, and it also formalizes the appointment of the lead registrant. Furthermore, it also typically covers, and especially if you have a good SIEF agreement, also governs how things are communicated, what are the channels, what are the platforms to do, and so forth. And as we are in Turkey, obviously all the agreements need to at least be in the Turkish language, but as there are so many foreign companies who are also providing chemicals, of course, to the Turkish market, most letter of accesses and SIEF agreements are bilingual. So first, the obligatory Turkish language, and then also, secondly, also in English, side by side, more or less, or one after the other. So I said earlier, SIEF agreements can be called anything essentially. You can also have like consortium agreements. We're not actually looking at those at all in this presentation. We're focusing more on like a lead registrant driven activities. So everything that we talk about in this presentation is related to or called SIEF agreements, and whereby you also then purchase the letter of access as part of this agreement set. But that's, as I said, it can be called something else depending on the joint submission and the SIEF and the lead registrant, obviously, and if there is a consortium available. So looking at what information is sent and what information is received by the lead registrant as part of this LOA process together with the co-registrants. So first, the lead registrant, of course, shares a data package with all the potential co-registrants. So this can be, for example, sent to all the participants in the SIEF. Typically, that is the way forward. Or alternatively, when companies contact the lead registrant and ask. But it's better to be proactive and share this information in the SIEF. And this package usually contains, of course, the SIEF agreement, including the cost sharing principles, as well as, of course, the letter of access price. And then in this example, for example, an acceptance letter to the SIEF agreement, so that you do not have to circulate the same SIEF agreements with all signatories. It's enough that you sign an acceptance letter to the master SIEF agreement. Thus, everyone can just sign this one acceptance letter and be governed by this agreement, and of course accepting the agreement. So once the acceptance letter has been signed by the co-registrant and provided, of course, to the lead registrant, the lead registrant then sends a letter of access invoice to this potential co-registrant. So once this co-registrant then has paid this invoice to the lead registrant, in this case, the lead registrant will then provide access to the joint submission in KKS, as we saw in the few slides ago. Optionally, the lead registrant can then share, as we discussed already, a CSR template where applicable, or then they share also the final CSR, depends on the case. They can share guidance of safe use information if applicable, and other supporting information for co-registrants for the purpose of them compiling their own co-registration dossier and so forth. So for example, like identified users covered and so forth. But on top of that, typically the lead registrant has already earlier, as discussed in previous webinars, have already shared the substance identity profile with the companies, as well as information on classification, and as mentioned, the uses that will be covered in the joint submission. Coming to cost sharing, always a favorite topic of everyone. So the lead registrant, of course, has the obligation to provide the co-registrants, the potential registrants, with a cost breakdown of all the costs that have been associated with developing the lead dossier. So this means data-related costs as well as administrative costs. And here, when I'm speaking about administrative costs, I'm referring to costs related to compiling, developing the dossier in KKS and so forth. So data sharing was something that we talked about in the previous webinar series, part 2. So I invite you to have a look at that for more information on data sharing. So for cost sharing purposes, the lead registrant must, of course, document the cost sharing model and do it clearly. I'll come back to why this is in a while. And of course, where possible, allocate the cost as far as possible on an endpoint level, so data endpoint level. This means that you are itemizing all the costs, at the endpoint level. This also means and covers, the data and administrative costs as mentioned. And also, the lead registrant should prepare justifications and provide proof, essentially, of where the costs are coming from. And of course, also establish a reimbursement scheme. So this is very important. Something that wasn't, for example, for EU REACH back in the day, for the first registration deadline, there were not many SIEFs, joint submission, where they actually were thinking about reimbursement in any great detail. But learning from EU REACH, this is something that needs to be done from the get-go for Turkey KKDIK lead registrations. So there are quite a lot of administrative burden on a lead registrant in allocating all these costs, documenting everything, itemizing the costs, and so forth. So this is something that for lead registrants, it's highly recommended that you start immediately with this documentation and itemization as the data trickles in. It is so much more difficult and burdensome to do it retroactively, as we learned from the data sharing regulation for EU, but I'll come back to that in just a few slides. And of course, all data and costs thereof need to be shared in a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory way. So this is very clear from the legal text. The same as the EU. So coming back to the data sharing regulation, and something that is also fairly favorite question to us. So what is happening with the data sharing regulation in Turkey? So I'll come back to that in just the next slide, actually. Just to give you a reminder of what it means for EU, is that actually in 2016 we already had this implementing regulation on joint submission and data sharing come into force. So it essentially defines what this fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory means in the context of the EU REACH regulation. So it brought with it a lot of more detail onto interpreting this fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory, amongst others, of course. So it set rules how to make, for example, data share agreements and SIEF agreements and letter of accesses and so forth as clear as possible and also comprehensive. By comprehensive meaning that you really needed to break down all the costs, study costs, administrative costs, and itemize them. Because the idea is that co-registrants only are required to share the cost of information that they need to submit. So it means that they do not, for example, have to pay for data that goes beyond the requirements of their tonnage band. So obviously, if you don't need it, you don't have to pay for it. So now, what is happening with the data sharing regulation in Turkey? So at the moment, the data sharing regulation is not in force in Turkey. There is no data sharing regulation. However, we can expect that there will be a similar regulation entering into force in Turkey rather sooner than later. So you can almost bet on it coming at one time or another. Therefore, we definitely and highly recommend that the lead registrant already now act as if the regulation would be in force, and you go ahead and itemize, of course, all costs as we discussed earlier, and document the cost sharing model and reimbursement mechanisms, and also consider future costs. Because doing this retroactively is really annoying and really burdensome. And this is something that happened for EU REACH because it entered into force in 2016, and obviously there were already registrations from 2010 and 2013 that we then had to retroactively fit into compliance with the implementing regulation on this data sharing. And that was quite difficult going back 6-7 years and try to itemize costs. So just try avoid doing that for KKDIK and just get things itemized and sorted, documented from the get-go. And with regards to future costs, you can bet on that there will be future costs related to updating and keeping your dossiers, the lead dossier up to date, the joint submission up to date, and so forth. So be prepared would be the underlying note here. Okay, so Sami will now talk more about joint registration management and then lead dossier maintenance before we head over to the action plan and so forth. So Sami, please go ahead and just tell me when to change slides.
Okay, thank you, Frederik. So let's look at the obligations and duties beyond the KKDIK registration deadline, meaning the obligations that starts in January 2024. We have divided this post-registration activity in two parts: management of the joint registration and keeping the registration dossier up to date. Tasks and processes needed to fulfill these activities will be discussed in the subsequent slides. Though the registration deadline will be in 2024, obligations related to the submitted dossiers do not stop there. In fact, requirements and other obligations of KKDIK remain unchanged. Registrants need to keep their data up to date and reply to any potential request for additional information from the authorities, for example, during the evaluation process. Furthermore, all registrants have ongoing duty to follow up and monitor regulatory developments of their substances. After the registration of a substance, a number of continuous and random or ad hoc tasks are to be carried out. This means that the companies need to check their REACH and SIEF mailboxes regularly and be ready to react to any correspondence following the registration. As mentioned earlier, the workload is and will be significantly heavier for companies acting as lead registrants, as they are required to deal with all inquiries from potential co-registrants and are responsible for the information submitted jointly. So the SIEF legal obligation will cease on 1st January 2024. It is advised that consortia or lead registrants replace SIEF-based contracts with long-term agreements, also called as a cooperation contract. This contract should lay down principles of future cooperation, and the contract should take into account, for example, financial compensation in case new studies need to be purchased, new data need to be generated, or dossier update activities performed upon substance evaluation by authority. Lead registrants should have a permanent mechanism to welcome newcomers to join the registration and to continue the communication between member registrants if a new registrant joins. This means that lead registrant or consortium manager should maintain letter of access sales and data access services and establish a well-organized process to allow proper management of these requests. Registrants, as said before, registrants need to pay only for the data that they need in their registration dossier, and they are entitled to ask for a full breakdown of the letter of access cost prior purchase. This implies that the lead registrant should have detailed documentation in place to prove the transparency required. In majority of cases, lead dossier require ongoing financial management involving the recalculation of letter of access cost, reimbursing registrants, and planning the finance management for keeping dossiers up to date in subsequent years. Then we will discuss another duty of the registrant, the maintenance obligation of the submitted dossier. The KKDIK registration dossiers are live documents, and the dossier has to reflect the current knowledge on how your substance can be used safely at production site and by users throughout the supply chain. The registrants are responsible on their own initiative to update their dossiers with new relevant information and to submit it to the authority according to KKDIK Article 23. This usually affects all registrants of the same substance, but it is a particular burden on lead registrants as they have conducted the chemical safety assessment and they have access to the original data and study reports. To comply with the obligations of KKDIK, lead registrant should schedule regular literature searches, the outcome of which should be included in the dossier. For this reason, it is important that you retain copies of the full dataset and the dossier in your Euclid Cloud account, even after they are submitted, so that you can continue to manage your Euclid data at a later stage. So the dossier updates may be divided to spontaneous ones and requested updates. If registrant becomes aware of any new data or information, he or she is obliged to update the dossier with that information. These are discussed in more detail in the next slide. Furthermore, Turkish authority is expected to put forward further measures in order to improve the quality of registration dossiers submitted by the companies. As an outcome of these compliance checks, an update of the dossier may be required. This means that appropriate level of resources within companies is needed to cope with short response times for commenting and timelines for testing defined by the authority. When compliance checks apply to the joint part of the dossier, lead registrant need to involve member registrants in discussion, get their feedback, and coordinate the response to the authorities. Often additional testing or arguments are required, and it is recommended that lead registrants take a proactive approach and do not wait for potential compliance check by authority. This list presents the so-called relevant new information that triggers registrant obligation to update their registration dossiers. Update is needed if there are changes in a registrant status of his identity, changes in the composition of the substance, changes in tonnage band, and new unidentified uses and new uses advised against. As well, update is needed if there is available new knowledge of the risks to human health or the environment, or changes in the classification and labeling of the registered substance, or updates or amendments of the chemical safety report of the guidance on safe use, or the registrant identifies the need to perform the tests listed in Annex 9 or Annex 10. Furthermore, you need to update the dossier if new importers need to be covered under your OR registration. The KKDIK regulation requires currently companies to update their registrations without undue delay when their chemicals data tonnage band or company information changes. As discussed earlier in EU REACH, an implementing regulation on dossier updates which came into force on December 2020 defines without undue delay more precisely and sets clear deadlines which are between 3 and 12 months within which an update to an existing dossier must be submitted to the European Chemicals Agency. So we expect that the same amendment will be implemented in KKDIK regulation in forthcoming years, and lead registrants should be aware of this already when submitting the original dossier. So my take-home message from this previous slides and post-registration activities are, firstly, that it remains the registrant responsibility to keep their data up to date and to update the registration dossier whenever new information is available. And secondly, which concerns particularly lead registrants, is that they need to reserve resources to the activities related to the finance and legal management of the joint submissions. Okay, thank you, Frederik, please.
Thank you, Sami. Okay, so now coming close to the end of the webinar, so not going too much over the 1 hour, but a bit. So looking at the action plan related to what we've discussed today, of course, good is to prepare the SIEF agreement in good time and cover all essential aspects, that is the communication responsibilities, reimbursement, cost sharing, future costs, and so forth in this SIEF agreement. And also the lead registrant, it is good to already act as if the data sharing regulation is in force in Turkey. So meaning that you would itemize all the costs, data and admin costs as far as possible, and maybe even on an endpoint level where applicable. Then you should also provide the SIEF agreements and including the letter of access promptly and in good time before the registration deadline. And here we actually recommend to do it at least 6 months before the deadline to allow for enough time for the co-registrants to submit their dossier, preferably a longer time, so meaning even 12 months before the deadline, so by end of this year, in other words. So the more time the co-registrants have time to do their payments of the letter of accesses, signing SIEF agreements and so forth, preparing their dossiers and submitting, the better. We'll try to avoid a situation where everyone is submitting at the last moment. That would probably not be a good thing. And then the obligation to cooperate in the SIEF is something that does not end with the registration, as Sami already mentioned. So you need to take care of your lead registration obligations towards the SIEF members, the joint submission, of course, continuously. So this is, once you accept being a lead registrant, you also accept a host of responsibilities towards your joint submission members, and of course to SIEF members who are aiming to join the joint submission. And of course keep the dossier up to date, and also keep the costs related to the joint submission constantly up to date. It's very annoying to go back and try to retroactively, as mentioned, figure out some past costs. It's easier to incrementally just add them as they come. Just our advice, having learned this the hard way, if you will. So be active with the communication as a lead registrant, and of course just document everything. It is a good practice to document your lead registration efforts, your communication efforts, and so forth, in case of any potential issues, disputes, and so forth in the future. So the conclusions, just taking a step back again, looking at not just the joint registration management, the whole KKDIK. So just of course know that it is in force and it is possible to late pre-register. So if you haven't done that, please do it as soon as possible. The registration phase will end by end of December this year, and these fees by the ministry apply. So by end of December 2023, not this year. And there was a question I saw already in the chat, a very common question, which I can already at this point torpedo down and say that there will be no extension to the registration deadline, and if there will, they would not tell it in advance. So aim and act accordingly, meaning you aim for the December 31st, 2023 registration deadline. Do not bet on it being changed. So as the lead registrant, of course, act as if the data sharing regulation is already in force, itemize things, it will come into force, you can bet on it. Take care of the lead registration obligations towards the SIEF and joint submission, because this is something you will be penalized for if you do not. And keep, of course, your dossiers up to date, as Sami mentioned already many times. And for non-Turkish manufacturers, formulators, you can choose a professional only representative in Turkey to take care of your KKDIK compliance if you haven't done so already, or if you are not happy with your current only representative. REACHLaw, for example, provides such services, and we're very happy to help, and of course also assist you with any lead registration and other topical issues. Okay, now coming to the Q&A part. Just give me just a minute to pull off the questions that we've received. So a few questions we got ahead of the webinar, so we'll start with those, and I invite my colleagues to provide answers to these as far as possible. So we'll start with the first question. So the question goes as follows: if there is no lead registrant in the SIEF, what to do? We do not have any test data based on registration requirements. So that is the question. And let us turn on the cameras just to show our faces for the Q&A session.
Okay, I can answer to this one. So all registrants need to agree that one of you should take the role of the lead registrant. So there are several ways to do that, and one could be that the company that has most interest in registering the substance probably have interest to take the lead position and volunteer for that role. You may also choose the co-registrant who has most of the data on the substance already available, or the one who has most information requirement to fulfill, so who is registering in the highest tonnage. That may be the most reasonable way to do it. Last thing, maybe then you can try a lottery if there's no other means work. Obviously, if you are the only registrant, then it's your only choice to take that lead role.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and there was continuation. This, if any data test data is, that doesn't matter. So it's if it's a SIEF, lead registrant has obligation to request test data from other SIEF members, and others have obligation to share at least the vertebrate data for the registration purposes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sami. And then there was also a question that it would be great if you could show the practical timeline of the lead registrant. And I think we did provide this already, and you are welcome to look at the presentation afterwards. So you can find it there. And also as part of the previous webinar sessions, part 1 and 2 will have looked at the timeline. So I invite you to look at those also. Then the question is, we're looking to know if it is possible to do joint registration yet. Before, it seemed like lead registrations have not been submitted. So the question is it possible to do a joint registration, I guess?
For the joint submission, to be able to do the joint submission, first the lead registration dossier have to be submitted, and the lead have to be prepared, the letter of access, and these kind of preparations. But at that time in Turkey, for the KKDIK, I could say that we can go case by case, but there are some lead registration dossier already submitted, and if one of your substances is inside of this, you can of course go to join the registration as well. But it's started very slowly, at least for now.
Exactly. Thank you, Sibel. And then the next question is, we would be interested to learn or understand more about the mandatory information to report in section 1.7, so list of importers. So Sibel, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Here 1.7, this is unlike REACH that we need to include the importer information in the registration dossier. Within this, we also, this importer will remain as the downstream user after this process. And in this case, the information we need is the full company name or the VAT number of the importer. This will already suffice to add this importer in the registration dossier at 1.7.
Yes. And as mentioned, this applies to the only representative. Isn't that so, Sibel?
Yes, this is only required for the only representatives. Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to make that clear. Okay, then there's a question of what is the relation of SIEF of ECHA and SIEF of KKDIK? So how will it impact the registration in KKDIK? So I guess the question is, well, what are the similarities or the differences? Sibel, do you want to take this one also?
Yeah, sure. I would say that there is no differences in between two cases. I mean, SIEF of ECHA and SIEF of KKDIK, sorry, are same and have the same formats. So by pre-registering a substance, you will become a member of the so-called pre-SIEF for that substance. And the idea of the pre-SIEF is that you can see who the other companies are and who had pre-registered the same substance. So you that can start preparing the joint registration together. And this is very important for the registration process.
Thank you, Sibel. And then the next question, we have received a lot of questions. We probably will not have time to go through all of this, but just we'll get back to all of you, if not here today verbally, then definitely in a written format. So the last question I have here as pre-submitted is, what will be the cost of submitting a dossier by the lead registrant and the members of the joint submission, including translation? So I can take this one and tell you that it, especially the lead dossier parts, depend a lot on the substance, on the volumes, hazards of the substance, what information is available. Obviously, most information would be available. That is the assumption. So for lead registration work, it is always case dependent. So I invite you to contact REACHLaw for a quotation, for example, for specific lead registration work. For the co-registration work, so the member registration, those are typically fixed, and there's the need to translate is minimal to none. So of course, existing information is put into the KKS system, but it is translated ad hoc by, for example, REACHLaw people. So there's no inherent separate translation cost in normal cases. So the short story being, please contact us for detailed information. It's very difficult to provide generic details on costs, unfortunately. Okay, coming back to questions from the chat. So as said, we do have a lot of questions, so probably just take a few of these as we are obviously over time already. Let's take the first one here. So are there any SVHC lists published for Turkey? Sibel, will you take this one, please?
Yeah, sure. Not yet. I would say that not yet. And we are expecting the list to be published at least at the end of 2022, maybe, yeah, as authority informed.
Okay, thank you, Sibel. Then there is a question about data requirements. Maybe Sami, Sibel, please take this one. So the question goes, does KKDIK require full tox studies to be submitted, or will robust study summaries only be required especially as have to be translated, So meaning what has to be translated as part of the information that is submitted as part of lead registration dossier. Sibel or Sami, who wants to take this?
I can take this.
Okay.
Sami? Yes, I would say that we for Turkey, first of all, do not need to translate the analytical report, the characterization part. And shortly can say that we are not obliged to translate the attachments except the CSR. And then other than this, study summaries and robust study summaries need to be translated, not the full studies, I can say. Yes, I think this answer can help on the translation part.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you, Sibel, for that. Let's just go forward because we have so many questions. So there was a question, what does that mean that CSR is not mandatory? So I think this was probably a poor choice of words. So it is mandatory, of course, for the joint submission. It's just not mandatory for the lead registrants to provide it as part of the package provided to the co-registrants. So it means that typically for most registrations, I would say that the lead registrant will cover the co-registrants in their CSR, or at least provide a template for the co-registrants to fill in with their company-specific information, and then submit that information as part of their co-registration dossier. So obviously, if a substance is registered at over 10 tons annually, then of course the CSR is mandatory, also in Turkey. Hope that clarifies the situation. Then we have, is there any way to know if the lead registrant provides the CSR or the guidance of safe use before doing the joint submission? So, Sibel, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I would say that the registrant, the co-registrant, cannot know if the lead registrants already provide the CSR or guidance of the safe use, unless they join the submission. In this case, cannot see from the KKS. They have to ask. They have to contact the leads for this case.
Yes, thank you, Sibel, and that ties into the next question. Do we need to be proactively in contact with the lead registrant, or will they contact us using the email as provided in the KKS system? So I'd say it depends a lot, of course, on the lead registrant. The way we work typically is that we, of course, approach the SIEF early on, describe who we are, what we will do, and the timeline for preparing the dossier, and timeline for providing access to the joint submission, and collecting obviously information and so forth. So as part of that, we typically also, if not immediately during the process, of course, communicate in the SIEF that these will be included or not included. But if for whatever reason this is unclear with you, or the lead registrant hasn't communicated this already, then of course you can always ask. So it's better to be certain than uncertain. So please just go ahead and ask. That would be my 10 cents on that. Then there's a question on Euclid, if you will. So the question is it possible to extract Euclid files or PDF versions from the KKS? So meaning, is it possible to, I assume, meaning export, is it possible to export the data set out of the KKS system as it is from the Euclid system, for example? So Sibel, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, but my telephone is ringing. And then it's as I also mentioned in the PPT, I can say that it's not possible to extract the registration dossier as same as Euclid, and it's not possible to extract, and it's not possible to import any dossier inside the KKS. Yeah,
exactly. So it's manual work putting in information. Obviously, you can attach attachments, but it's not that you can import some sort of a container file containing everything as with Euclid and REACH, I think. as time is really getting a lot, I would just take the last question here, and I think this is also a very typical question that we get. So what are the typical cost of a letter of access for KKDIK for same substances in comparison with the EU REACH? So an excellent question, and of course they're very early on in the whole process, but based on our knowledge of the letter of access is available at the moment, they are, in many cases, they are very much in line with the EU letter of accesses. In some cases they are cheaper, but in some cases they can also be more expensive. But this is something that we'll know more as we go forward. But at the moment, for the substances that we're following, we're pretty close with the EU letter of access fees. But as I said, this is an ongoing story to be looked at in more detail as we go along. So don't forget on letter of access is being cheap. That would be probably the underlying message here. Okay, so we have a lot of questions. We'll come back to you in a Q&A file on this, and for some of the questions which were more specific to specific company situations, we'll come back to you on that directly to get more information on your case to be able to provide a good answer. So with that being said, I thank you very much for attending this webinar. And as mentioned, when we are recording of this webinars, you can always come back and revisit different sections. And we'll try also to put this on YouTube, so it will be very easy for you to access. So thank you very much to my colleagues, Sibel and Sami, of course, and a special big thanks to all the attendees of this webinar. I hope you found this interesting and informative. And if you are a lead registrant, good luck with the work. And if you need any support, please feel free to contact REACHLaw. We'll be happy to help and provide, of course, a quotation, for example. So thank you very much and be safe.
Bye-bye.